Dr. Bessel van der Kolk has said that based on neuroimaging studies that he has collaborated on, that the brain's executive functions become impaired when a traumatized person attempts to focus on their trauma. The imprint of the trauma doesn't sit in the understanding, thinking part of the brain, but in the deeper, more primitive regions of the brain, such as the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the brainstem. These parts of the brain are only marginally affected by language. To do effective therapy, we need to do things that change the way that people regulate these core functions, which probably can't be done by language alone. Now, what happens when we experience an event, let's say an upsetting or even a traumatic event, is we experience it through our five senses. That information then goes to a part of our brain called the thalamus, which serves a function, it's a bit like a router. And what it does, it routes information along two pathways. One pathway is to the thinking part of the brain, the cortex. The other pathway is to the more primitive limbic system, the emotional midbrain, and that goes directly to the amygdala. Now, the problem is that the pathway to the amygdala is the shortcut. It gets there first. So if something is particularly painful or traumatic, that information gets imprinted and coded directly into the amygdala before the thinking brain has any opportunity to process the information. Once that information is locked into the amygdala, then what happens is it's like setting an alarm. You might think of the amygdala as functioning like the alarm center for the brain. And as soon as something is imprinted in that, the alarm is set. From that point on, anything that looks like, sounds like, smells like, tastes like, feels like, any sensory representation or reminder of that upsetting and painful experience immediately activates that alarm system. And when the amygdala fires off that alarm, you don't hear sirens or bells. What you experience is a physiological change. As your heart rate increases, as your blood pressure increases, as you begin to perspire, basically your body is preparing itself to run for your life or fight for your life. Let's take a look at another way of representing this. In this depiction, what we have is the image of a snake. So let's say that you're walking through the forest and you look down and you see a snake. Well, as long as you haven't had any upsetting or traumatic experiences with that snake, the thinking part of your brain is able to process that information. What it might do is say, well, okay, I'm 10 feet away from that snake and it's going in another direction, so I'm safe, and oh, okay, that's interesting. There is a snake there. But you remain relatively calm. However, if you've had a previous bad experience with a snake, let's say, for instance, at some point in your childhood, you were bitten by a poisonous snake, and that was very painful, and it required a medical intervention that was traumatic in and of itself. Well, that pain got imprinted deeply into the emotional midbrain. So now the alarm is set. So when you walk through the woods and you look over and you see the snake, all of a sudden that information more quickly reaches the amygdala, the alarm center. It recognizes the past trauma. It sets off the alarm, and all of a sudden your heart is racing and you feel like running in a panic. In fact, oftentimes what happens is when that alarm center revs up intensely enough, the thinking part of the brain actually begins to shut down, so that Well, it's only natural if you think about it. When you really need to run or fight for your life, you don't need to sit and philosophize or ponder intellectual possibilities. So, in that moment of fear and activation of the alarm system, what happens is that alarm center revs up your sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system, if you don't remember this from biology, is a part of the autonomic nervous system. And we might think of two main branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And they're very easy to distinguish because the sympathetic is a bit like the gas pedal in a vehicle. If your car was sitting on the railroad tracks and all of a sudden you noticed a train is coming, you would stomp on the gas pedal to get you out of harm's way. However, once danger had passed, you would begin tapping the brake to begin to slow the vehicle back down. Well, your nervous system works much the same way. If you looked over and saw that snake and it activated the alarm center of your brain because of a past traumatic event, your nervous system would begin to rev up and put you into the fight or flight reflex. It's like stomping on the gas. So your sympathetic nervous system takes over. Once the danger is sufficiently past, the parasympathetic taps the brake, calms you back down so that you can return to your normal level of functioning. Now, this is all great unless the alarm center is firing off when there's no real threat, no real danger. In other words, a false alarm. In fact, this is very commonplace with people who have been traumatized. When a person has been traumatized, this emotional midbrain, well, it's not very discriminatory. And it's a very simple mechanism. So what it does, it works on a better safe than sorry basis. So in fact, if anything even remotely resembles, looks like, sounds like, smells like, feels like a reminder of that traumatic event, then what happens is the alarm fires off. And it really doesn't matter whether or not there is actually a danger present or not. For instance, if you'd been traumatized by having been bitten by a poisonous snake once in your life, and if the trauma is very robust, what you might find is that opening a book and looking at a picture of a snake might cause your heart rate to increase. Well, now the thinking part of your brain, the rational reasoning part, the intelligent part, knows that that picture in the book cannot bite you. However, the primitive midbrain reacts anyway. It sets off the alarm just in case. Better safe than sorry. Well, that does help promote survival of the species. However, if your alarm center is going off indiscriminately, if you're having multiple or repeated false alarms, and your nervous system is constantly being revved up and you're going into states of fear or panic for no good reason, then that can be very troubling. In fact, that's what people that suffer from PTSD, panic attacks, extreme states of anxiety, phobias, experience on a routine basis. So the problem becomes, how do we deal with this? As I mentioned earlier, because the part of the brain, in fact, if you think about it, if this is your brain, and this part is the primitive emotional midbrain, and this is the thinking brain, the cortex. If the problem lies in this emotional midbrain, a part of the brain that doesn't work with language. In fact, it's too primitive to work with language. Language is a function of the sophisticated cortex, the thinking brain. So if the problem has become imprinted in a primitive part of the brain that does not work well with language, How do we reach that? Well, obviously, language is not an effective intervention to reach and treat this part of the brain. In other words, the frustrating experience that many trauma survivors have encountered is in conventional therapies that are language-based, talk-oriented. They found that they couldn't be talked out of their trauma. And it's because language does not reach here. Language works with the cortex, the thinking part of the brain. So that's the problem. How do we reach and soothe the part of the brain that doesn't work with language? Well, that's where evidence-based acupressure points come in.